Barton is a historical archaeologist and assistant professor of archaeology at Francis Marion University in South Carolina. He earned his PhD at Temple University, where his research focused on Timbuktu, New Jersey. Chris's research focuses more broadly on the archaeology of class, gender, and race. Among his many publications is his book, co-authored with Kyle Somerville, Historical Racialized Toys in the United States. He is interested in the use of archaeology as a medium for social activism and in developing collaborative projects in which the public, students, and professionals work as partners in uncovering the past. His forthcoming reader, From Trials to the Trenches, Archaeology as Social Activism, will be available this year. So thank you so much, Chris, for being here with us and experimenting with this technology.
Right.
Sorry I can't be there. Given I doubt that anybody actually wants to listen to somebody talk over the internet, so I'll try to keep this as short as possible. I know most of us want coffee. Luckily, I have my coffee here. So, thanks for you guys. This is not my story. I can only offer you a few lines, just this one chapter of Timbuktu. The stories of perseverance, resistance, and triumph do not flow through my veins. Those tales echo in the hearts and minds of Timbuktu descendants. And though those echoes do reverberate with me, they do not come from my voice. My ancestors and I did not feel the shackles of slavery. We did not taste the bitterness of segregation. We did not endure the gazes of modern racism. I'm an archaeologist. I don't own the past. Yes, I learned how to excavate. I was taught how to make sense out of thousands of artifacts. But that does not give me a monopoly on interpretation. We archaeologists are not the sole gatekeepers of the past. We are but a fraction of a broader community that find meaning and significance in sites such as Timbuktu. Timbuktu is not my past. I'm just the guy who was lucky enough to dig there. Timbuktu was established in 1826 when formerly enslaved brothers David Ezekiel and Wardell Parker and Ezekiel Hall from Maryland established a community. Parkers and Hill purchased their individual lots from a local white Quaker, William Hilliard, from 1826 through 1828. However, it was not until 1830 that the name Timbuktu first appeared on deeds. Now, the population of Timbuktu follows around three criteria. 1, natural reproduction. 2, the 1804 Gradual Emancipation Act. And 3, the Underground Railroad. First, natural reproduction. Well, when a mommy and a daddy love each other very much, I think that we all know about natural reproduction already. Number 2, 1804 Act for Gradual Emancipation of Slavery said, quote, that every child born of a slave within this state after the 4th of July next shall be free, but shall remain the servant of the owner of his or her mother, if a male until the age of 25, and if a female until the age of 21. So that around 1826, the first generations of Black New Jerseyans would be emancipated at the same time that Timbuktu was being established. Third, and the one I'd like to focus on, is the role of Timbuktu in the Underground Railroad. Charles Reloch's important work focusing on the Underground Railroad has highlighted the important role that Black churches played for securing people's freedom. And the AME Zion at Timbuktu served a similar role. There are likely 2 reasons for the location of Timbuktu. One is its location near the waterway. As Harriet Tubman's famous words of advice to wade in the water was used to emphasize to enslaved people to use rivers, creeks, bays, and oceans to find freedom. This is a similar case as what we see at Timbuktu, as its location is along Rancocas Creek. The second reason for Timbuktu is Quaker. Timbuktu is close to the Quaker town of Mount Holly, and we find a similar settlement pattern throughout South Jersey. At nearly every historic Quaker town, from East Greenwich to Salem, Swedesboro to Woodbury, Haddonfield to Mount Holly, you will find a nearby free Black community and a waterway. This network of the Underground Railroad, as seen here in the red, was known as the Greenwich Line, which extended from Greenwich near the Delaware Bay, which was actually cut off down by Salem, through the Western controlled areas of the Quakers in Jersey, and all the way up into New York City. As many of you know, trying to directly associate a particular site with the Underground Railroad is difficult, given the needed secretive nature of the network and its lack of documentary resources. However, if we look at the census records from 1850, 1860, and 1870, we can glean some very important information at Timbuktu. The 1850 census, taken 15 years before the end of racialized slavery, was the first to ask for the residents' place of origin. In 1850 and 1860, while slavery was still being practiced and fugitive slave laws were enforced, several of the Timbuktu residents told the census taker that they had been born in New Jersey or in another northern state with similar emancipation laws, like Pennsylvania or Massachusetts. In 1870, 5 years after the abolishment of slavery, those very same people told the census taker that they were in fact born in former slaveholding southern states. For example, in 1850, James Hill, age 40, told the census taker that he was born in New Jersey. Then in 1860, at the age of 50, he claimed to have been from Pennsylvania. And finally, in 1870, he told the census taker that in fact he was originally from Virginia. What could be the reason for this? Well, if we circle back to the 1804 Gradual Abolition Act, if James Hill was 40 in 1850 and from New Jersey, as he claimed, then he would have been over the 25-year requirement and thus legally free. And the same could be said in 1860 with him claiming origin from Pennsylvania. But in 1870, there was no longer a need for this tactic. So when he's asked where he's from, he replies with Virginia. Another example can be seen from Elizabeth Hamilton, age 33, who in 1860 claims to be from Massachusetts, and then in 1870 tells the taker that she is in fact from Maryland. On an important side note, it's interesting to note that out of the 17 possible quote-unquote runaway captives, 13 of them identified in the census records were from Maryland. Again, the same state where the founders of Timbuktu had fled. Given the community's experiences with slave catchers and their supplies, including several well-documented cases such as the Battle of Pine Swamp, there was a natural distrust of outsiders like the census takers. Thus, when the taker would come to visit a former captive, the person would tell them a lie or an alternative fact about their origins as a means of entrapment. Thus, this rereading of the census could offer us not only insights into the involvement of communities in the Underground Railroad, but also identify possible individuals as well as their archaeological sites. So now I'm going to switch a little bit, and I want to talk about social and economic class. Given the lack of cultural, political, and social capital, many of the residents were unable to garner employment below manual labor or domestic, low-paying domestic servants. Yes, many of the residents of Timbuktu were collectively, quote, poor due to structural issues of race and class. However, to interpret the archaeology of Timbuktu as a simple cause and effect relationship, that is, poor people buy inexpensive things, does a disservice to the people. Rather, we believe that the people of Timbuktu were socialized into a habitus that sought to improvise on the everyday. This habitus was not based on binary decisions of what was the least expensive means to make or consume, but rather a learned disposition that actively weighed the time, energy, and economic costs of everyday practice into broader networks of capitalism, ideology, and power. From here, I wanted to discuss the practice of yard sweeping as both reflective and constitutive of improvisation. So here to your right, you'll see this is a ground penetrating radar. This is a geophysical survey that was conducted to us by John Milner and Associates. And to your left, you'll see the basic outline for Timbuktu with Rancocas Creek located in the south. And then the main thoroughfare up north, where it says Timbuktu, that is Rancocas Road. In 2009, this geophysical survey, we came together as the Timbuktu Discovery Project, and we selected the red kind of rectangle there for our first areas of excavation. This area was originally owned by William Davis, who was freeborn in 1836 in Northampton. He was a brick molder. Later, he enlists in the United States Colored Troops, where he is injured at the Battle of Petersburg and honorably discharged in 1865. Davis purchased the lot in the 20 by 100 foot lot from Mary Simmons Estate in 1879 for the sum of $2. Davis constructs a 12 by 16 foot home on a brick foundation, likely built on piers with a kind of a half loft. Here, him and his wife Rebecca, who's listed in the census records as a laundress, raise 5 children. Our excavations were conducted from 2010 through 2011. From the interior of the 12 by 16 structure, we found a trash midden that had been used basically from about the 1880s to about the 1940s. In here, we found 15,422 artifacts. But what we found of note was outside of this area, we were not finding any artifacts in the interpreted occupation level. Only 276 artifacts were actually recovered outside of this area, and they were in the north excavation unit number 4 and excavation unit number 6, likely the result of plow scars. So we came across this idea and we weren't really too sure. We were unable to find evidence for a buried A horizon in the immediate area. But we could identify compacted occupation level, but no associated artifacts in the level or any evidence of vegetative growth over time. Seeing better here, you can see the evidence for the former plow cutting through and a very, very simple soil profile. But again, within the immediate vicinity of the Davis home, we were not finding any evidence of a previous vegetative state. So given the site's context, this left us with the possibility of yard sweeping. In order to conserve the landscape and limit destruction, we chose a conservative survey plan that included split spooning and using a 2-inch auger testing, seen here. So we're going to go from right to left. Right is feature 13, which is the Davis site. And then as we move further away, all the way to boring 13, this is when we're getting to Charles Love House. He was another USCT. Our sample boring depths measured from the southwestern datum point of excavation unit 9. What we started to find were some interesting findings. Specifically in borings 1, 2, 3, and 17 showed a similar pattern of compacted clay loam with no artifacts recovered. However, as we started to move away from feature 13 in borings 4, 5, and 16, all less than 25 feet away from the Davis Foundation, we saw a very thin, dark grayish brown stratum that appeared in the profile at roughly 1 foot below contemporary grade. The stratum was interpreted as a buried surface. This grew to a maximum level of 0.06 inches in boring 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 14, and 15. Moreover, in our auger tests, we were able to find small fragments of charcoal, brick, glass, transfer print ironstone, and unidentifiable metal fragments. This is actually very common as the scattering artifacts away from swept yards. Additionally, because of the foot traffic and the broom strokes, there's often no vegetation within the immediate surrounding areas of a swept yard. And simply the small artifacts get displaced as you move further and further away from the feature. So now let's talk about the archaeology of yard sweeping. In the review of research in Delaware, Luanda Dukunzo interpreted evidence of black yard sweeping as rooted in West African traditions. Dukunzo identifies 4 purposes of swept yards. First, swept yards often offered protection for the home's inhabitants, both spiritually and in the everyday from snakes and pests. Second, the clean yard underscored the virtuosity of the owner. Third, Given that yards were stages for socialization, swept yards promoted community identity. And finally, the maintained areas of the yard represented a medium for honoring the owner's family and ancestors. Whitney Battle Baptiste looks at swept yards at the cabins of Hermitage as evidence of social networks of enslaved Black women. While she argues that swept yards were rooted in West African spiritualism, she also discusses how the practices and its meanings transitioned through time. Understandably, swept yards were not only stages for spiritualism, but also arenas for working and socializing. Everything from laundry to food preparation, child rearing to adult gatherings. Swept yards were extensions of the home. They were dynamic landscapes that were imbued with significance and meaning. Yards provided a space for vital social interaction. Battle Baptiste further posits that the creation and maintenance of swept yards sustained Black resistance. At Hermitage, where the owner and the enslaved peoples lived less than 40 feet away from one another, Battle Baptiste contends that the swept yards delineated a clear separation between the outside worlds of human bondage and the private domains cultivated and controlled by enslaved Black women. Now, this idea of differentiation and delineation is interesting when we're talking about our interpretations at Timbuktu. As a practice of yard sweeping at Timbuktu contested with the developing middle-class practice of lawn care in the latter half of the 19th century. In a proverbial keeping up with the Joneses, colorful flower beds, trimmed hedges, and lush green gardens were powerful markers used by the rising middle class to underscore both the owner's individuality as well as their belonging to the collective identity of being middle class. As with swept yards, the lawn was a socially and physically constructed scape that was the projection of the home and its inhabitants. However, the meanings of the functions of the lawns contrasted deeply with those swept yards. Rather than a presentation of the natural and the pristine, swept yards were purposely devoid of life. And while white middle-class yards reproduced divisions of the natural versus domestic sphere, often with no people ever occupying the lawn itself, swept yards were by their very nature the physical extensions of the home that blurred the physical and social distinctions between the domestic sphere and the immediate outside. Yard sweeping is an intergenerationally learned practice. And while the origins of the Davis's swept yards may have been attributed to West African tradition, there is an underlying connection to the social and economic class. This brings us back to improvisation. The economic position of the Davis can be interpreted from probate records, U.S. pension records, and the limited size of their home. The small house, coupled with the heat of a New Jersey summer, would have made the interior of the house excessively hot. As opposed to the interior home, the swept outdoor surfaces made for cooler area for the family to perform everyday work, including laundry, to cook, and to socialize. I believe that the Davis's practice of yard sweeping was a form of improvisation. Again, I argue that these practices are not simply on-the-spot decisions, but a tradition of life on the social and economic periphery. These practices of improvisation were not passive to marginalization, but rather these people were active social agents within the landscape. Go back. We see examples of yard sweeping along with other racial and ethnic groups. The Dutch, the Irish, where I've conducted some work on Great Blasket Island, and the white working classes as seen here in Delaware, to your right. But the one commonality between all these groups, including the Davises, was their marginalized economic status. At Timbuktu, the practice of yard sweeping may have been rooted in West African inspired traditions, but as seen at the Heritage, as time passed and the distances grew, the meanings associated with the practices took on additional meanings and functions for the economically marginalized residents. We cannot undervalue the social aspects of these swept yards. as they provided people with safe spaces for their family and friends. Though the barren soils of the swept yards contrasted with the lush green lawns that embodied the white middle class, for people socialized into the practice of yard sweeping, the cultivated landscapes underscored a collective memory, a collective identity of both an African legacy as well as a shared social and economic position. The identities interpreted in swept yards contrasted with the fenced-in, highly individualistic, and often unaccompanied lawns of the middle classes, in that on the bare grounds of swept yards, people came together, not apart. While the swept yards were devoid of plant life, they were not devoid of everyday life, as yards were spaces where people learned, worked, and socialized. Thank you.